Good.
Mm-hmm.
And we are live. Hello, Trish Jenkins here. I am an evangelist. I do preach, and I am a woman. Surprise, surprise. Well, hello to Facebook and YouTube. The debate over women doing things, speaking their station, it's been set off by a couple of scriptures that Paul wrote. And recently I came across a book called What's with Paul and Women, and I tracked down the author, who you see here, Jon Zens, and we are going to talk to him deeper detail about those things. And if you're watching live, please pop a question in the comments, give us a like, subscribe, whatever you feel to. All trolls will be blocked, so there you go. Here we go. We've already got Noni on. Peace and blessings. Lovely to have you on, Noni. Yeah, so what I'll do is when the comments come up, John, I will show them and we'll just pause and acknowledge those. So welcome to my beautiful new friend, Jon Zens. Yay! I should have some background noise of cheering, shouldn't I? How are you?
Good to be here with you.
Oh, so lovely. So, John, you've been a preacher for a long, long time. I read your bio and you've got all sorts of qualifications. So you're not just someone who's had an opinion and thought you'd be contrarian writing a book. So tell me where your background and how you came to write this book, What's with Paul and Women.
I was not raised in a Christian home, and I was age 19 before I heard anything substantive out of the scriptures, and so it was age 20 that the Lord opened my eyes, and I found Him, and began to read the scriptures and memorizing mainly from the Gospels, and I ended up being in a fundamentalist Baptist church for the first 2 years of my believing life, and so it was a tradition, of course, that tends to put down women.
Excuse me a minute, John. Excuse me a minute. I have to interrupt you. There's a lovely lady who has just sat down beside you. Dottie, now that you're here, you have to stay.
Okay.
This is John's lovely wife, Dottie. We've talked before. Right. So we've got about half an hour. We can go a bit over time if we get a bit worked up. So how did you come to you said you're in a fundamentalist sort of Christian church, which I believe means really strict and super conservative. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yeah.
And
that was in California.
Right. But you didn't write this book. Like, were you always interested in that topic, or was it something that you became aware of later in life? I think, tell us about the awakening.
In the middle 70s, I started looking at Christian ethics, and my research was leading me to see that the history of so-called Christian ethics was really an overview of the Ten Commandments, and there wasn't really any sense of a new covenant coming that would change things. And so that led me to a new commandment I give you, to love one another. And when I began to research that led me to love one another. And I looked at the one another's, and there are 58 one another's in the New Testament. Encourage one another, pray for one another, et cetera, et cetera. So then that led me to think, well, are all these one another's just for men, or are they for the whole body, including women? So that's where my study of the women's subject came into play. And I knew there were several scriptures used to silence women. So, I was wrestling with it. I wondered what was going on. So I ended up, beginning to look into those passages. Way back in 1981 was the first article I wrote on women. called Aspects of Female Priesthood. And
Right.
anyway, so that was the beginning of it, and then I just kept going with it, and of course, a lot of people well, not a lot, but some people I was around in my circle of influence were said that women should be silent in the meetings. So I was coming up against that, and so it was actually in 2003 when Dottie and I went to Christians for Biblical Equality gathering in Orlando, Florida, and Linda Belleville.
Wait. Well, sorry. I need to I haven't heard of that. Christians for Biblical Equality.
Yeah, CBE.
Wow. Okay. Impressed you. That we would even need to have that. Anyway, go on.
I don't know if you've heard of Mimi Haddad, but she's the sort of the director of the Christians for Biblical Equality that's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Okay.
But anyway, Linda Belleville gave a workshop at that gathering in 2003, and it was on 1 Timothy 2, and she was said that she would go through the whole grammar and just the whole structure of the passage and show that there were some serious problems that the translators weren't really dealing with, honestly. And so she gave her presentations for probably about an hour. And when she was done, I was basically numb. I was just incredibly blown away with what she presented. So after that, then I decided that something needed to be said, and so I began to work on What's with Paul, what became What's with Paul and Women, that was released, I believe, in 2011. But anyway, so that's sort of the journey in a nutshell in terms of the issue of women. So it took me a while to, you might say, get the whole stretch of the whole thing, but bit by bit it kept coming, and Linda Belleville was sort of a turning point that really accelerated my understanding of the passage. And so that's, in a nutshell, that's how I came to focus on the woman issue.
Right. And there have been a lot of books written by women on the issue, and they're very good. And some people might be saying to me, "Well, Trish, why have you got a man on to talk about women's issues?" And I'm very happy to have women on talking about those issues. There's been some great authors and great books. But the fact is, if we want to change things, unfortunately, we do need our brothers. Well, not unfortunately, but we need our brothers to speak up. So it's not just a women's issue. It's, someone like Jon speaking up on the issue that the men who have a misunderstanding of the scripture they're not even going to listen to a woman. So which is really disrespectful, because Jesus spent time listening and talking to women and getting their input.
Right.
And this is it. It's just how it is. I came across your book, and it was so. What I loved about it is that it was clear and simple. Like I've read some great books on it that are quite theologically, it's quite academic, and even though I could understand them, I would have struggled to turn around and tell someone in a summary what that said. But I want my daughters to read your book, because you've put it in language that is clear and easy to understand. So our first one is that you want to bring out that point about women being silent in church, or should learn in silence, but that's not actually the right word. I'll just check on our oh, look, hi Mum. Mum is watching. Yeah, good. She's a pastor, and she's a feisty. My mum is a pastor and a feisty lady. She and Dad have always been equal in their marriage, and becoming saved really didn't change that. And we need our brothers as allies. You're right, Noni, because we need, it's not about us and them. So talk to me about that scripture where it says women learning in silence.
Right. Well, obviously, that's really the passage that those who believe women should basically be non-functional. That's the main passage that they sit on. And but there's as Linda Belleville pointed out, there's a host of problems with the typical and traditional interpretation of that. And I'd like to sit on that for a few minutes.
Yeah.
So the Greek word there is hesukia, and it's translated silence in the King James and many other versions. Most modern versions tend to go to quietness instead of silence, but the older versions tend to go with silence. But anyway, hesukia does not mean silence. It means quietness. And it's
Right.
the same word used up in verse 2 of this chapter, where Paul says that we should live quiet lives while we're praying for those in authority and such like that. And so Paul tells there in that passage, he tells all of us to live quiet lives, not silent lives. That would be stupid. That doesn't make any sense. We're not silent, but we're not rabble rousers. We're trying to lead a quiet life in peace with others, and that's what the word it means. And so, right there in verse 2, he used the word that's in the later verse, and of course it's translated quietness up in verse 2, but the King James has silence, in verse 12 or whatever it is, and so. We need to underscore then that there are translation issues in this passage and the other ones for that matter. But we have to affirm that any version of the New Testament that uses the word silence there is not the mind of God. The mind of God is quietness, and that is not a female issue. Paul enjoins all believers to live a quiet life. So it's not a gender thing. Male and female are to live quiet lives. So when he says that he's not suffering a woman to teach, but to learn in silence, the meaning is he's there to learn in quietness. And when I began to check that out, I discovered that basically men and women learn in quietness. It's not that women learn in quietness and men learn in some other way. All believers are to have a quiet, receptive, submissive spirit where they can learn from one another. And give and take, and talk things through. And so that was really a striking thing to me. And as I researched all of this, and I realized that there's so many preachers that dogmatically say, probably almost every Sunday, the Bible says women are to be silent. God's word says it. It's true. And women are to be silent. Well, unfortunately, they're wrong. That's a terrible translation. It's not the mind of the Lord. And so they're putting something as a burden on people that isn't even the right translation. And so that's the kind of thing you face, is you got to sort through how I would have to say biased translators like the King James people, were biased. And so when they did that passage, they used the word silence, and they should have known that it meant quietness, because this word is used in verse 2. So it's right there. And it doesn't mean silence there, it means quietness. So there's prejudice, unfortunately, and of course, and no version is perfect. But the point is, there is undoubtedly male bias, and for that matter, ecclesiological bias, if you will, in the way that certain things are translated. And so it's something we have to sort through in honesty as we can ascertain what the words really mean.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's only one. I mean, the King James used the word charity, which we now use love, and even then, they're different kinds of love. So we know that the translations change over time. Is it that preachers get lazy that they go to Bible school, they go to divinity school, they get a doctor of this and doctor of that and whatever they want to, to impress people. But this is what I struggle with. How can people, men, not because they're men, but how can people who are so well educated or have so much education, is it that there's so much study to do that they really only take notice of the most immediate topics that are on their radar that are to do with them, like getting people saved, delivered, making sure you take up a good tithe? Oh, is that in the Bible? We won't go there. No. But, the things that matter to keep the church growing and functioning,
right.
Why is that? Why are people so well educated and yet they don't bother noticing those details?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer, but we all should admit that we have biases and we have baggage that affects when we read the Bible. We read it with certain lenses, but it's to me, it's having done a lot of research in this area that to me it's shocking that, as you point out, that there are men that know Greek much better than I do, but when they went to deal with some text, they totally botched it. So I can't explain why that happens, but I do know that certainly there is bias towards certain ways of looking at church and ways of looking at women and other things that where when they're translating, they lean toward. For example, the whole issue of what we call church leadership. Right. There's a horrible translation in the NIV that in Hebrews 13:17 it says, "Obey those who have the rule over you and submit to their authority." That is a wretched translation of that passage. And preachers have used that passage to hit people over the head, to submit to their authority and on and on and on. But here's the thing. What? Here's the thing. The Greek verb there in Hebrews 13 is patho, and it means to persuade. And it's the verb used in Acts 17 when Paul was persuading the Jews out of the Old Testament that Jesus was the Christ. And it's in the middle voice. And so it literally means let yourselves be persuaded by those who guide you.
Whoa, and so the word hold on. I just have to pause there for a moment and let that sink in.
Right. That's huge.
That right there, John, that is huge. That is massive, because you're absolutely right. And I've read the books on submission and obedience and the blessing that comes to do with, and that this emphasis on honoring leadership, which honor should go both ways.
Yes.
And that the last will be first and the first will be last. And Jesus talking about, if you want to be the greatest, then you are to serve. And we twist that into something more glamorous. It's huge, because we are all equal in the eyes of God. Now, if I've got someone who is, there might be someone who is teaching me something, and it might be my daughter's friend might come to my house to show me something on the computer. If she directs me to do something, I'm going to follow her direction. I'm going to kind of, obey might not be the right word, but I will obey a 20-year-old telling me, Trish, if you click on this before you click on that, and then it will work.
Yep.
Well, she's got my interest at heart. My ego doesn't have a problem with it, but I'm taking that direction from someone that she doesn't boss me around. I don't boss her around, or him. And kind of like, it's that kind of attitude I'd be thinking that the church needs to have. It's a little different when it's an employment circumstance.
Right.
And here's my look. I'm torn. I'm torn between feeling angry. Yeah. And then being disappointed in myself, because I'm quite capable, and I have always been quite capable of doing the research myself. I would have expected more from the leaders I've had, quite honestly. But at the same time, I'm responsible for my Bible learning. So I could have done this research as well, just as every one of us has. And here's the thing. I got saved at 16 and I was in a great church. I think I've been in like probably 5 churches that were all female supportive and affirming. They all had active, I don't like the phrase pastor's wife because that would, a pastor's wife is obviously usually married to a pastor's husband. So they're both co-pastors.
Yeah.
Unless someone has a job doing something else and they genuinely don't pastor, they just happen to be the husband or the wife of the person who does it. I do think couples are best suited to leading a church. That's a different topic. So here's the thing: when I say growing up, coming into adulthood and being in that environment where there was no problem with women preaching, it was more a lack of women desiring to, but we still had some. There were probably 2 of them would have been so dominant, so I don't want to say controlling, but they actually, other women really didn't get a chance. But there's that as well. It's true that there are females who can be that way. They won't let anyone else sort of come up. But here's the thing: with the pastors who believed and encouraged the women, but it wasn't proactive. It was never really proactive. And because it was accepted that it was okay for women to be involved, it wasn't even really a topic of conversation. I'd only thought they were these fringe weirdos. There was one person that I met, this couple, who turned out to be weirdos and con artists and creepy. And I didn't put it down to him being a Christian. He was creepy anyway. And they turned out to be predators in the church. They were wolves in sheep's clothing that ripped people off. And he was so smug when he talked about, oh yeah, and she's like, oh yeah. And I'm just thinking, I just felt sick when I heard it. So I just put it down to weirdos. And the complacency of that is that pastors will preach, they'll say it's what God gave them, but it's going to be drawn out of what's on their radar. And so that's like in the world, in the workplace, it's called unconscious bias, because you just don't notice things. If you don't have a particular issue in your church, like if you had a lot of people in wheelchairs in your church, you would be more conscious of making sure that you catered for them. But if you don't see them, if they're not there, well, sometimes they're there and people don't see them and they don't cater for them. But if it's not on the radar, it's not preached. And so I was not equipped, and I'm kind of disappointed that I was not equipped with this sort of knowledge, so that when I went beyond the walls of my church, I didn't really have a good response to people who threw this out. And it reminds me, the shallowness of it reminds me, how is this any different? And this will be a bit controversial, but how is this any different to when Christians owned slaves, John? And they read those King James verses about slavery. Tell me, is that any tell me, is that any different?
Yeah, well, the proof texts that were used in the Civil War and all by both sides, it's the Bible has been used to support the most damnable thing. So that's not a new thing, but it just shows that in a practical sense, it isn't the fault of the Bible, but the Bible becomes a wax nose where you can shape it into anything you want with your proof text. So that's why it's important to always look at the whole setting and not just a proof text. That's pretty dangerous. Back to Hebrews 13 and the word there.
Yeah, and like Noni's just saying that she wants to study as well. It does make you want to study it properly. We all should. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, the NIV has submit to their authority. Well, the word authority isn't even in the text. That's a word they inserted. Now that illustrates then that these men are church leaders. So naturally, when they deal with certain texts like this, they tend to lean in to the authority of the leaders. So that could account for why they chose the word authority when it isn't even in the text. And so I was present in Nashville, Tennessee in 1980 when the NIV came out, and they had like about 20 people from the translation committees there, and they gave each of us the New Testament, and they told us that if you read it and find anything that you don't care for, or you think is wrong, let us know, and we'll work on it. Well, I actually did submit something to them, and they did change it in the final version. But anyway, the point being, here are all these guys, 20 of them, that are just sharp in Greek, and they know it very well, and yet they translated Hebrews 13:17 in a wretched, horrible way. And the only way to account for it, they know the word authority isn't there. They know the word patho means to persuade. Why did they switch it to obey and authority? It's the only way you can conclude is that there's some bias there, that they wanted to buttress the idea of being a leader with authority. So anyway, that's very sad, but that's the reality. And obviously there are translation nuances that come just because of the nature of the beast, but there's others where the bias comes into play, and where they're actually changing the mind of God to, an agenda, some kind of program. So that's just something that you be aware of, and we need to, again, read with discernment, whatever we're doing.
Yes, we really do. And particularly in the evangelical churches that are more about, have a greater emphasis on Holy Spirit, such as the Pentecostal ones, you will often hear it supported with, oh, and God said this to me, God told me this or that. And I'm always very careful about using that phrase, even in prophecy, that God would say this. I learned very early on to be cautious about that and say, look, I believe that this is what I'm getting for you, to hear. So, you read these books and there's very little referencing, very little interpretation, original language, but it's, and then God stopped me and said, do you see this, or do you see that, and tells them things. And I don't doubt that God does do that. That's a rhema word, but it has to be backed up. I mean, I come from, as you know, I had that financial experience that landed me in trouble. But, prior to that, and part of the culture of and I do believe in prosperity. I do believe that, God wants to bless us, and that, we should be blessed. But the extreme of the prosperity doctrine taken so that it's all taken to the point of idolatry and self-interest is that people, it's almost like reading tea leaves. They'll see signals and credit it to God, when there's so much of the Bible about financial wisdom, which is more about steady plodding. But you hear one testimony about, it didn't make sense, the numbers didn't add up, but God said do it, so I did, and now I'm a gazillionaire. I just go, you know what? Maybe God did. Maybe that is what happened. But that's not something you should tell the masses. That's the exception, not the rule.
Right.
People will take that. So this interpretation business and adding God's voice to give you credibility, it's kind of cheating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we should, at some point, we should talk about the influence of the Artemis cult in First Timothy 2.
I would love to do that. Let's do that now. And we're going to keep going. And so if we need to do this in 2 parts, we will, but we'll keep going with this as one broadcast. Right. And if you'd like to stay with us, Give us a hoy, give us a like. Click on if you're enjoying this, click like, and if you'd like to add a comment, we would love to do that. And then, Mum's just mentioned that Shauna is a great. Shauna must be watching as well on Facebook. So let's talk about the cult of Artemis in that culture now.
So when Paul wrote that epistle to Timothy, he was in Ephesus, and what defined Ephesus is the temple of Artemis that was like the eighth wonder of the world at that time, and it would be similar to the phenomenon that takes place in say Salt Lake City, where you have the gigantic presence of Mormonism on your right and on your left and in front of your face. And that would be pretty much like what Ephesus was like regarding Artemis. And this temple was imposing, it was intimidating, it was huge. They had 128 marble pillars that were 6 feet wide, and they had, just a massive structure that was sitting up so halfway up a hill or whatever, and when the fog would roll over the mountain, it was like a do experience, and people would just go berserk with that fog coming in. It was so mystical and all that. But anyway, so here you have a woman-centered cult in Ephesus, and I'm in my research, then I concluded ultimately that you cannot understand 1 Timothy 2 without appreciating the presence of the Artemis cult in the city and the resulting of some women coming out of that and coming into the body of Christ. So that helps then when you factor that in, you can begin to make sense of the passage. Because first of all, Paul says that he wills that the men pray, raising up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Okay. And then he says, and I will that the women pray, not with braided hair and jewels and all that. And then he goes on to say about I'm not allowing a woman to teach, but to learn in quietness, etc. So, and then he mentions at the end of that chapter the childbirth passage, which is extremely enigmatic, and there's been 100 interpretations of what that means. But the point is, once you put the cult of Artemis into the picture, then it all begins to make sense, because Paul is saying that the way that the Artemis women prayed was not with slaughtering animals or anything, but they would doll their hair up into braided hair, and then they would tuck jewels in their hair, and then they would come into the whatever the area is, sanctuary or whatever, and they would raise their hands and they would pray to Artemis, and that's how they prayed. And so the focus was on their hair, made up beautifully, and the jewels that adorned their head. So that's why Paul says, not with jewels and all that. In other words, Christian women don't need to doll their hair up and all that kind of stuff. They can come right to Jesus with their requests, and they don't need, regardless of how they're dressed. And then
it was actually freeing them. It was actually freeing the women from the obligation, and also from a financial burden, because those women who were poorer would not have been able to afford to put the jewels in the hair, right? So there was an egalitarianism in the early church, where they were sensitive and cared for those who didn't have as much money. And not only that, you've got the whole vanity thing of showing off of your wealth and riches, which you're not to embarrass. The Bible's, I can't remember the verse, but there are verses that indicate not to shame or embarrass someone who is not as well off as you.
Yeah. So and then when
the braids also prayers.
The braiding was actually in wrapped up in their prayers. And there was the braids were symbols of their prayers, And
Wow.
that was how it worked for them.
Mhm.
And so Paul is saying, hey, you don't need to get involved in any of that. That's in Jesus, you're fine. But the other thing is too, he mentions then for them to dress modestly. Again, once you understand the Artemis cult, that makes more sense. Why would he tell the women to dress modestly? Well, you can imagine women coming out of the Artemis cult might not be dressing exactly the best way.
It was
So
prostitution.
yeah, right. So
Right.
Yes.
so in other words, you could see why an admonition to dress modestly might be appropriate with women coming out of a female cult where prostitution was rampant. And then when Paul says that Adam was created first and then Eve, why he's not saying that because of an authority thing where Adam was over Eve. He's saying it because in the Artemis cult, the woman came first. Artemis came out first, and then her twin, I believe it was Zeno or whatever, came out after her. And so in the Artemis cult, women were first. So Paul's giving a reality check there and saying, hey, the reality is that Eve came out of Adam, and that's the way it was. Not that a woman came out first, and all that. So that's why Paul is saying that, giving a reality check about the fact that Adam was created first and then Eve came out of him, not because Adam was over Eve in some kind of authority structure. And then when you come to the I am not allowing a woman to teach, isn't it interesting that, and this is a huge question, I haven't seen it addressed hardly at all, but to me it's a crucial benchmark kind of thing. Why does Paul say, I will that men, plural, pray? Then he says, I will that women pray. Then he says, I am not now allowing a woman. He goes plural, male, plural, female, and then singular, female. Why does he do that? And
I have not noticed that before. Let's just pause there for a second.
Yep.
Yeah, because and you're looking at the Greek words. You're not getting the Greek words confused.
No, those Greek words are fairly straightforward. Mm-hmm.
Plural,
male, plural, female, singular, female.
Singular indicating a specific female.
Yeah, it could be one or a few, but just woman is singular. So just from that, you would have a hard time concluding that Paul is making a universal rule for all Christian women and all Christian places on the earth. He's talking about a particular woman who apparently was causing problem, and she more than likely came out of the Artemis cult, and so she might have been a little bossy and wanting her way. And so Paul is saying, hey, you're not ready to teach yet. You need to be in a posture of learning. And you learn in quietness. And look, so that helps.
The fact that he's talking about a specific woman indicates that there's probably been an inquiry come to him. There's been a report or something. People have written to him or spoken to him and said, look, this is what's been going on. And he's writing a response. And when I learned that, a lot of the epistles were responses to questions that churches had sent him, we're not going to get the other side of the argument. Like if he had said, now, to answer your question about Jane Smith, that would have made it a bit clearer, but it's not. And yeah, Marilyn, you're right. We're free from being told, but thank you, Marilyn. And I wanted to make sure I included that. This is what people don't realize because they don't look at the context. And this is what I loved about the book. And it's not a big book. It's not hard work. It's one that's explaining things. So yeah, do go on because that's fascinating that it was a particular person.
Right. So number one, it indicates that to stretch the singular woman into all women everywhere. That's not handling the Bible very honestly, in my opinion. And obviously I had to grow into that because that was not where I was years ago. But and then the second thing being that the woman being in a quiet position of quietness, because of more than likely she may have been a bossy, pushy kind of person, and so then you can appreciate why he said to not use, as well as the traditional versions put it, not usurp authority over a man. But again, that's a horrible translation. The word, the Greek word there for I have to think what word am I thinking of? It's not usurp. It's no, I it's have authority over. That word is used only in this text and nowhere else in the New Testament, and it people have assumed that it means authority over, but it's a word that's pretty tricky. And Linda Belleville went into the history of this word in great detail, and she shows how in the old Greek plays back in 300 BC and all that, the word was used to murder someone. Then it moved on and took over a nuance of where someone was paid to kill someone. Then it came over more to a nuance of getting your way with somebody. And that's where Linda used an illustration of in the first or second century, somewhere in there, where a ship captain had made an agreement with a family to take some goods on his ship somewhere, and they would be on the ship too. And so they agreed on a price and all that. Well, then the people came back and the captain said, I'm going to have to raise the price to this. Well, they were upset because he had agreed, to the first price. So then this word is used there where they sort of bantered back and forth with him, and they prevailed, and he gave them their original price, and that's where this word authentane is used. So in that saying, it meant this family got their way with the captain finally. So it has the idea of, you might say, negotiating, trying to persuade to get your position to be taken, something like that. So anyway, the bottom line is this: there's a 2-volume set written by Lau and Nida where they categorize Greek words according to their, so you might say their action words. They categorize words. And so they have, of course, a set of authority words. Well, guess what? Authentane is not in that list. They did not put authentane into the authority list because that's was not the essence of what it was about. And in the first century, it was not used in the way that we have generally taken it, not have authority over somebody. That's not what it meant. So that's a crucial thing there. So how it should be translated is a little tricky, but the best I'm come up with is something like nor to have her way with a man. In other words, would imply that the woman is bossy or pushy, and they're trying to get their way with males or something. That's the best I can come up with. But it doesn't have the idea of being an authority over another person. That is not the meaning of the word. And you can check that out in word dictionaries where they go into great detail on how a Greek word is used through the centuries. And so authentane, is a word, as I said, it's only used there in Timothy. So we don't have any other usages of it in the New Testament, but it was used quite often outside the New Testament. And we can see that in those settings, it did not mean to have an authority over another person. It meant other things, even murder. So again, that just shows you that the way that King James and other versions have translated it, to just assume it means authority over, and then to imply that women should not be an authority over men. Well, that's not even what the text is about. So they're totally building an infrastructure on something that's wrong in the first place. So that's a very crucial thing. And then when you come to the Adam and Eve mention, I already went over this, that Paul was not mentioning Adam and Eve because of gender power, but he was mentioning it because in the Artemis cult, women came first. So he was correcting them and giving a reality check. And then when you come to the very difficult childbirth text, then now you add Artemis to the picture, and it makes sense, because now in the Artemis cult, Artemis was not so much a fertility goddess; she was more of a maintaining women who were pregnant. So when you got pregnant, you would immediately go to Artemis, and she would be your patron saint or whatever, and you would commit your pregnancy and all to her. So Paul is saying, you don't need to commit yourself, or bring yourself before Artemis. You bring yourself before the Lord, and the Lord will take care of you in your pregnancy. So once you factor the Artemis cult into this passage, the verses begin to make some real sense. Otherwise, you're just picking and choosing and trying to figure it out. And especially the pregnancy passage, that is so off the wall.
It's like,
people,
where did it come from? Yeah.
So
it's like,
anyway,
it's like so random, but
right.
It's actually not.
But once you add the Artemis cult to the background of that passage, then it begins to make some sense. Maybe not every little question is answered, but it gives you a grid by which to look at the passage in a more sensible, honest way. And as you know, and at least in America, like Nazarene groups use the makeup passage. They say women shouldn't wear lipstick, they shouldn't wear jewelry on them and all that, and they use that passage. But see, that has nothing to do with what Paul was talking about. He wasn't prohibiting women from wearing proper jewelry and that kind of thing, but he was focusing on their gaudiness of their hairdo and their jewels, and that was connected with their former way of life in the Artemis cult. And he's saying, no, you don't need to do all that. And that's ridiculous. You just come to the Lord. He's right there. He'll take care of you. And he'll also take care of you in your pregnancy.
Yeah. And it's that's so helpful. And the reference to a woman not teaching was about one specific woman.
Right.
Because Paul had a number of women teaching in the New Testament.
Right. And that another thing to consider too, as you mentioned earlier, we're only hearing half the conversation. So in other words, we don't know what Paul and what Timothy had said to Paul, or what their conversation was about this woman. In other words, we don't know anything about her or whatever, but Timothy and Paul knew about this, and so Paul said something to correct it, because obviously a pushy person in an assembly is not good, and they should not be teachers. They should be learning in quietness, and maybe a year down the pike, maybe they can start teaching or something. But so that's
exactly right. It's so good, because you've got men who are bossy and who won't listen, and you have got women who are bossy and won't listen. And some women get into a leadership position and they pull the ladder up after them. They do it in the world, and they can do it in church too, where they want to be the special one. They want to be the one that's the, oh yeah, we have women preachers. Look, there's one over there. There's one. Actually, when I got saved in the 80s, there were a lot of female role models in the movement that I was in, and I could name them. And these days, it doesn't seem to be so much. I can probably count them on one hand. And I wonder how much of that is that as we've grown as a movement and become more established, because we were very evangelical back then, just young churches growing and growing. I wonder somehow if our getting more middle-aged, complacent, that we can settle back, because women can use they may not be the ones that they may look personalities. Some personalities naturally lend themselves to the preaching component of pastoring, because pastoring is more than that. Excuse me a sec. Stop scratching. It's Dash. It's my little scratching thing. He's going to say hello. Come here. This. Here we go. He's there. There he is. Yeah. There he is. I just put him down. Where was I? Oh, the certain. If you have certain gifts, I was talking about this with my husband this morning. If one of us was better at handling the finances than the other, they'd be the person looking after that. If someone's better in the garden, they'd handle that. It's not a male female role, you know.
Right.
And we've both done investments and business together. And so, you know, and there have been seasons where one of us has been out working more than the other one, but it's been according to what works for our family. And in terms of so where I was getting at is I would love to see more female leaders, pastors, particularly, not just pastors, but stepping up and presenting. But if it's not their bent, that's okay. It just would be nice to have a few more role models instead of the 2 or 3 that gets pointed to. I'm currently in a church where there are a lot more females on the roster, but that had been my experience in recent history. And you know, that this whole order, and even the word headship, as I think we'd had another conversation, the word head doesn't mean above.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about that. What about that definition with the head?
Do you want to bring out the woman up in Canada? Yeah.
Thanks, Dottie.
Yeah, the head. Again, we assume generally that head means somebody in authority, and certainly the word can be used like that. But we need to remember too that even in our language, head can mean source. So we use the phrase headwaters. That's where a river starts, where it originates. And the word, again, in the word head, kephale, in the first century was not an authority word. It was basically like in the Old Testament, the translation of the Old Testament into Greek called the Septuagint. The head, the word for in Hebrew is rosh, and so rosh is used, I think, like over 300 times in the Old Testament, and many of those times it refers just to a human head. And the interesting thing is that the word rosh is not used of princes, kings, and people that are in authority. It's just not used. So in the New Testament times, kephale was used as source, and that was a common way of looking at it. Again, Lau and Nida, in their book on categorizing Greek words, they don't put kephale in the authority structure. So, of course, I found a few occasions where you could take the word head as having some kind of authority thing, but usually that's not the general way it was used. So for us to read into that head means the person who makes decisions, the person who's at the top, you know, all that, that's just not right. That does not square with the way the word was used generally in the first century. So that's another supposition we have that's wrong. And so I've seen so many books that say in the home, the father is the decision maker. That is just simply, that is wrong.
And even if he's an idiot, you need to obey him and God will look after you. It's like, what the? Really?
Right. Yeah.
That's
so
just crazy stuff.
Is it, I mean, this is serious. I mean, is it any wonder many Christian households are screwed up when they have teaching like this that's basically telling the wife to do X, Y, and Z when a discerning mind would think, well, wait a minute, you know. But here, let me say something since we're on this that's important, is 1 Corinthians 7. It's the only place in the New Testament where the word authority is used with reference to man and wife. And isn't it interesting that it's not about the man being over the woman or the woman being over the man? It's mutual. Paul says that each each spouse has authority over the spouse's body. And so he says if the husband feels led to go work in Turkey for a while or whatever, he can't just say, I'm leaving for Turkey tomorrow. It says they should have mutual consent. The Greek word is symphony. They should be in symphony about it. So they should discuss it. And honey, I feel like I'm supposed to go to Turkey and work for a couple of months. There's work there. Okay, so they talk it over. Well, you don't get the feeling.
You are the first male pastor. Actually, you're probably the first Christian leader I've ever heard refer to authority over one another's bodies in regard to something other than sex.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like you just said, I want to, he might say, I'm going to go to Turkey. I'm going to take my body and go over there. Like, what is it? Like, yeah.
So Paul's view is that if they're supposed to reach symphony about him leaving for a couple of months to go work somewhere, doesn't that sort of raise the possibility that that's the way marriage should generally work? Is that the
Absolutely.
husband and wife should want to be one-minded? They should want to be in symphony. So it's not a question of the man saying, "Well, we're going to do this," and the woman thinks, "What? All right, that isn't what the Lord wants." So I mean, you just create tension once one party or the other has the authority to make a decision without the other. It should be mutual.
Right. You are absolutely right. And Marilyn makes the point, we don't need a head if we're all part of the royal priesthood, because Jesus is the head and we are the body.
Right.
And she's referring to the authority. You make a good point, Marilyn. That's true. That it is. And if we're to become one flesh, then we are equal. Men do tend to be drawn to hierarchies. It is a Western way of thinking, whereas Eastern thinking is not so linear. And if you take for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is not really credible anymore, but it was that we needed air, food, and shelter, and then whatever the list is, social and then at the top was sort of spiritual fulfillment and stuff. Well, really, a Christian would turn that upside down and say, well, we need God first. We need spirituality first to even be alive. But does it even need to be one on top of the other, that something has to be, why does it need to be that? Right. Why wouldn't it be more of a wheel or something blend? It's like, why does it have to be? Someone always wants to be in charge, which brings me to the point of where that really comes from, because the first example of someone wanting to take God's power over someone else was Satan, wasn't he? When he wanted to redirect the worship that was supposed to go to God, I'm just saying I know it's spirit, but it was redirecting to himself. He got tossed out for that. And idolatry is taking worship that belongs to God and putting it somewhere else. This desire, this need to have someone else do what you want.
Right.
To me, that's like self-idolatry.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, Jesus said that the Gentiles like to lord it over their subjects and be called benefactors. Not so among you, for you are brothers and sisters. So that's a whole dimension of things that we've pretty much lost in terms of the way church functions and stuff. And so we're used to thinking that the buck needs to stop somewhere. But I suggest that the buck stops with Jesus. And we're not down here to be the one on top of another and all that. Chain of command, that's great for maybe the military, but that's not part of the body of Christ. We're all brothers and sisters. Why can't we accept that? And of course, we have different roles and functions, but that doesn't make us over other people. And it's interesting, when God gave dominion to Adam and Eve, he did not give them dominion over other people. He gave them a dominion over the earth. And then likewise,
right.
when Jesus gave authority to his disciples, it was not over other people. It was over demons and principalities and powers. And so we've got, again, we're all messed up. And our thinking is totally away from where Jesus is at. Jesus
Yeah.
isn't about who's in charge, because when you do that, you miss the fact that he's in charge. And that's our whole problem, is we don't trust him to be our king and our leader. We need, just like Israel, they wanted a king, and they got, a whole lot of trouble with that. So we're just like that generally. We want a king. We want somebody we can see who's in the position of authority. But why aren't we happy and content with just having the Lord as our king and trust him to lead the ecclesia on earth? And believe me, he's capable. So
It
that's
does, because we want instant answers. We don't want to. We're in a rush. We want to get on with things. We don't want to spend the time seeking God for what He wants for our lives and for how we're to serve, not necessarily be great. And so instead, it's actually a very dangerous position to be in, to be a pastor that teaches this stuff about, God, God's in charge, but he uses me. So therefore you need to obey me like you obey God. That is idolatry. And, I would recommend every minister listen to, read your book, which I will show everyone. And Kathy, you are absolutely right. Jesus is our only captain. And that doesn't mean, as we said, that we don't listen. Like if I've got someone who's younger than me showing me how to do something, teaching me something, I'm going to follow their directions, and I'm going to respect what's on their life, their gift. Right. It's not about their gender or their age or anything. Obviously I'm deferent to people who are, sort of elderly and that sort of thing out of respect. But it's a huge thing. I would recommend your book. Yes, I'm going to show it, but also, and I did mention it in the comments, I spent some of last year listening to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And that's a podcast that I think should put the fear of God into every leader, because and it's not just about Mark Driscoll and how he expressed his leadership and what effect that had on women and families and the young men. That women were you're in sin if you went out to work, and what a burden that puts on a young father trying to support a family and so on, or a husband. It's just over the top. So Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, but also I want to share the screen so that people get to see your website. I'll bring that up. And there we are. So this is your jonzens.com, which you've written a number of books on various topics, but quite a few of them. And that, like, here's another one, No Will of My Own, How Patriarchy Smothers Female Dignity. This is the page of the book that we're talking about, What's with Paul and Women. It's not an expensive book. You can get it as an ebook. You can get it as a physical book. And I just think it's something that it just is very succinct and easy to read. I just think everybody should grab a copy of that. And I'm not getting any kickbacks for the promo. This is what I would recommend. And it pretty much, it's great. So and I've got your website I'm going to put that up on the screen. Let's see, I will go to here and so it's simply jonzens.com. And I'd like to invite Dottie, because I don't want to demonstrate that the man has done all the speaking. And even though you were the author, Dottie, is there anything you'd like to contribute to our conversation for the people listening and for the people who'll be watching the recording?
Oh, I had so many thoughts as we were going through it. I will say that Jon spent 200 hours studying this topic. So he really distilled it down. And he's been writing for a long time, and he's gotten more succinct and more, just easy. It's easy for people to digest, which is very important. And the ministry that I'm in, it has certainly been aided by Jon's equality. I'll tell you, so I have a ministry in strip clubs. And we were just working on editing my book, Jesus in the Strip Clubs, Finding Hidden Jewels in the Night. And
okay.
Yes. So
Great
this
topic. A different kind of hidden jewels, right?
Right. I mean, they're amazing. They're some of the most amazing women I've ever met.
Yes.
And here they are. But last night, as Jon and I were editing this particular book, it was about one of the bartenders that I was very, very close to. And I am sure Jesus is going to save her. And she comes from a religious background. And I don't know what happened with her father, but whatever it was not good. And she loves her mom. Well, I have known her for several years as I've been going to this strip club. And this particular night was so ordained by God. Jon, because I didn't have anyone to go in with me, Jon sits out in the car. And this particular bartender knows that. He knows that if I'm not in there with another woman who is a co-worker, Jon is sitting out in the car. He never comes inside the door. And this says a lot to everyone, the men and the women. But I don't talk about it. But they know. So this particular woman that I love so much, we were there almost alone that night, and which is unusual. And she wasn't working. She was not the bartender. She was just sitting there. And God made her come that night. And she said, "Where's Jon?" And I said, "He's out in the car." And she walked me to the door. Oh, I gave her a copy of that book, Yancey's book.
What good is God?
What good is God? Isn't that a great title? So I thought, perfect place. So she took it and she walked me to the door and opened the door and saw Jon, and Jon waved at her. And she came over to the car and he rolled down the window and she gave him a hug.
Oh.
To me, that is like saying, "You are the best man ever."
Oh. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, if I could reach through the screen, I'd give you both a big hug.
Oh,
So
well, I'm all for that.
Have to do it virtually.
That's my main ministry. Yeah, so I think it's very, very, very important, the equality of women with men. And Jon nuzzled up to it, but didn't quite put the words. When God told Adam and Eve they were both in charge of the creation. They both, well, I think he named the animals before her, and that's when he realized
he was alone.
Yeah, I'm alone. Well, everybody else, all these other animals, had females, male and female, and he was alone. And when God created Eve out of Adam, he made them equal, and they both were given authority over the creation.
Yeah.
So we've started off in the wrong way, even from the very beginning.
Even from the beginning. And Satan, when Satan addressed Eve, I read recently that he actually used the plural, you will not surely die. So which indicates that it's quite likely that Adam was there too.
Yes, he was.
He was speaking to both of them.
Yeah.
Yep.
It wasn't like he was off doing something over there and she was wandering around out of the kitchen where she should have stayed. It was that they were together. So this business of looking at culture and language and context is vital, because you're talking about people's salvations and how they live their life. That's a lot of interference and influence into an individual's life and marriage and how they raise their children and what they do. So, you're asking a lot of people just to come and listen to you in your church. It's a privilege that people would take that part of their world. And they can worship God, but if they choose your church, then respect the fact that they are honoring. Be honored that these people would come and listen and do your homework and do a good job, and don't let question your bias, because that's how we grow. And look, it's not that hard. It's just more, if we can get our pride out of the way. Nobody wants to be wrong, and you can even be right and do it in a wrong way.
Exactly.
We think we're right, but we don't get it right. With certain things that it's just not necessary. And gosh, it's been such a wonderful experience to sit, and I could just keep going and listen, but people have got things to do, as you do as well. And I'll be keen to even slice up this video into sections that you'll be able to do things with. But look, Jon and Dottie, it's been an absolute pleasure and a thrill to talk with you. Our audience has enjoyed it. If you're watching the recording, continue to add your comments, because I do monitor them and respond to them as they go. And I just want to encourage you. This is not us beating up the church. This is us encouraging not just leaders and pastors, but everybody to explore and go deeper, question ourselves, so that, God's not worried about being found out that what you thought he meant was not right. He's not, God is still God. You're not going to blow it.
I think reflecting back on your question, in terms of my adding something, I think this is so huge that pastors can have such a pathetic view of women that they can send them back into abusive families, abusive husbands, and tell them to stay there. That to me is close to murder.
Look, it is, and it's abuse. In Australia, they tend not to these days in Australia, they haven't done that for a long time. But what they do, and I've seen this even with certain, I could name them, but certain teachers on submission and authority, they don't take non-physical abuse seriously. So when mental cruelty and mental and emotional abuse is a very real thing as well. So it's almost like if there's no bruises, you just have to be sweeter to win them over. But if you've got demonic stuff going on in your house, that's not okay. It's not okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes, also too, here there are laws in place now where you can't just, you used to be able to talk to someone and get some counsel, some good counsel, and get some prayer. And a lot of pastors won't do that. They'll send you off to a paid counselor who's legally qualified, and that's a good thing, except that the church still needs to be equipped with wisdom as well as advice, not control. But we're so busy, we need to have our relationships with our girlfriends, the older women teaching the younger women, as long as they're teaching them the right thing.
Right.
So we get back to focusing on Jesus instead of taking some obscure scriptures and seeing his model, particularly with women and children. Then it's a completely different attitude. Just recently, I watched a conversation online between, it's from 2012, Francis Chan and Mark Driscoll, and there was another fella there. And they were talking to Francis Chan about the fact that he was leaving his big church. And they were trying to, I don't know whether they were trying to counsel him or they were trying to, about questioning him about prosperity and all that sort of thing. And you can Google it, you can find it. But the contrast it was all very respectful, but the contrast in the heart, one was about leadership. The other one had the pastor's heart, and the fact that he was giving up his big church because he cared so much for the poor.
Yeah.
He wasn't anti-finance.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't preaching a poverty doctrine. He was just his heart was just breaking, and he wanted to be more effective. Now, I don't know a lot of details of what's gone on since then, but I just watched that conversation, and and to Mark Driscoll's credit, he listened. He was sort of nodding and making all the right noises and sounds. But that was also at a time when his church was in turmoil, and things were only a couple of years being completely shut down. But the attitude of self-greatness and that need to be important and be influential, as opposed to that servant's heart. That genuine pastor's heart. Pastoring is not something it's an honor. You don't have to call yourself, emphasize the leadership part. Anyway, we better finish up, I guess. We'll say goodbye. We've gone on a bit longer, but it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. And we'll say goodbye now. I wish you all the best, and we'll stay in touch. And everybody, make sure that you pick up any and all of Jon's books, but particularly the one, What's with Paul and Women, Unlocking the Cultural Background to 1 Timothy chapter 2. I hope this has been a blessing to you.
God bless you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
we love you.